Every time we have a new model, there's a set of capabilities that are different. People tend to think about model intelligence as IQ. We think of it kind of differently. Intelligence for us is multidimensional. It's not just a score. What is the real world capability of this model? Each model generation gives you the chance to do more with it, to do it better, to do it more efficiently, because we think the returns to frontier intelligence are extremely high. And it's extremely high, especially in enterprise. That's a core thesis of our business.
Krishna, I have been so excited for this conversation because you get to see from the inside one of the most interesting businesses in world history at maybe the most interesting time in world history, at least if you're a technologist or care about technology. One of the things that fascinates me most, just to like dive right into something that I think we're both quite passionate about, is this question of compute that you have to deal with all day, every day. It's a key part of what you do. It's a key part of what these companies are doing. And there's just this whole revolution happening. I'd love you to just start by explaining what it's like to have to deal with that. Like, I understand at one point you were having like a daily meeting about how to allocate to compute and to who and why. Just like bring us into that part of your life, because I think it's like right at the cutting edge of what's going on.
Look, the compute that we procure it's the lifeblood of our business. It is the most important thing in the company. It is the thing on which it's like the canvas on which everything else gets built. And so the decisions we make and how much compute to buy are some of the most consequential and hardest decisions to make in the entire company. You know, think of it this way: if you buy too much compute, you go out of business. If you buy too little compute, you can't serve your customers, and you're not at the frontier. It's the same thing. So, you know, we talk a lot about this cone of uncertainty, but the idea of just these purchases that have these real world implications, right? You can't just go out and, you know, buy a gigawatt of compute and have it delivered next week. You have to really think ahead to plan for this. And so we really take a very disciplined approach to how we think about it. So we look bottoms up. You know, we model what we think demand will be. Obviously, we sometimes get that wrong. We think about the compute we need to stay at the frontier, and we really look ahead and try to estimate that. And then as we go out and actually do these deals to procure compute, you know, flexibility is really important to us. And so we build that flexibility into the deals themselves. We build that flexibility into how we use the compute as well, because the way in which we bridge from a position we are today to where we want to go when the business is growing exponentially is to use that compute as efficiently as possible. I would say I spend 30 or 40% of my time on compute, even today.
What does flexibility mean in that example?
So it means a couple of different things. Number one, you know, we use 3 different chip platforms. So we are customers of Amazon's Trainium chip, Google's TPUs, and NVIDIA's GPUs. You know, we use these chips fungibly. So if you think about the compute we buy, we're using it for model development. We're using it internally to speed up our own product and model development. And then we're also using it, obviously, to serve customers. We, across those 3 chip platforms, we're using compute for all of those internal and external uses. And that flexibility, it actually took us a long time to be able to do that. We've invested in that over multiple years to be what I believe the most efficient users of compute amongst any of the frontier labs. And that's not something that just happened overnight. You know, when we started using TPUs, I think it was maybe the 3rd generation TPUs was the first one we used at scale. People thought, oh, well, you're crazy. Everyone's using GPUs. Why aren't you using GPUs? And we've invested very heavily to be able to use that compute incredibly flexibly. And then we look across the different generations of those chip platforms and use each generation for the best workload internally. And so we really built this orchestration layer that gives us that flexibility to use all different types of compute. And in doing so, we also are able to get the most value out of it.
Am I thinking about this in the right way, that like something like CUDA that has been a part of NVIDIA's story for a long time now, that allows you to do a lot with the underlying actual hardware, that you want to sort of eke your way into being as close to the bare metal as possible, and that's part of this flexibility and being able to control as many of the variables as you can. Is that the journey that you've been on?
That's part of the journey for sure, but it's also been actually pretty collaborative. So we work really closely with the Annapurna Labs team at Amazon to help to influence the roadmap of these chips, because you know we believe, you know, what we're doing is really stressing the limits of what these chips are capable of. And that means that like $1 of compute inside our organization goes further than I think it does anywhere else. But importantly, importantly, we basically want to utilize each chip to its best purpose within the company. So that does mean that we're building our own compilers. We're really building things from the chip level up in order to have that customization and that flexibility to use it internally the way we think will generate the most ROI.
Can you explain this cone of uncertainty thing? Like, I want to ask about all the component parts of this, but that feels like a really key starting point or overall frame for how to think about both sourcing and then the uses of compute. Can you just explain what that concept is?
Sure. When you're building and growing a business exponentially, really small movements in monthly or weekly growth rates result in compounding very, very different outcomes. And so as we're thinking ahead, even with our revenue growth, it's really hard to predict this business, right? And it's really hard. I think humans mostly think linearly, and you think incrementally. And that's something, I've been at the company for 2 years. That's something that's a paradigm I've had to break for myself, right? To stop just thinking linearly and think on this exponential. But when you're on this exponential, again, the range of outcomes starts to be really, really wide. We look at a range of scenarios, and we look at different points in that cone of uncertainty over, a 1 to 2 year period, and then we kind of work backwards from that. And what we want to do is we want to be at a place where we can, obviously still be at the frontier. That's the most important thing, to be able to serve customers, and then to be able to have enough internal compute to accelerate our employees. It's interesting. If we were to say to our employees, you can't use our models anymore, we could serve billions of dollars of revenue with that compute that we allocate to employees internally. But we want to take a long-term view and a long-term perspective on that cone of uncertainty because we want to range towards the top end of these outcomes, but we have to plan for that. And as we go, that's how we think about buying compute in a disciplined way. The most important thing is what happens if you are at one point in the cone of uncertainty, but you've only bought compute for a different point. That's where this compute efficiency is something that it really has helped us out.
Can you bring us into the room for the conversations around the trade-offs between those? I'm so interested by those three buckets of training, research, internal use, broadly speaking, and then serving customer demand. Naively, you might think okay, it's a third allocation or something. How much does that range around? What are the trade-offs? What is that discussion like on an ongoing basis?
We, in addition to meeting about compute procurement, we meet a lot about compute allocation. I think what's important is it starts with a place where our culture is one that's incredibly collaborative, and that informs how this conversation happens. So there's not fiefdoms. It's done in a very collaborative, not a zero-sum way. But there's a level of compute for model development that we will not go below. Right? So even if it means it's harder to serve customers or we have to do kind of unnatural things when it comes to that, we want to continue to make that long-term investment in developing the best models because we think the returns to frontier intelligence are extremely high. And it's extremely high, especially in enterprise. But so that kind of puts a floor on the compute that's allocated to model development. And then as we think about the internal use of compute, it really helps us to speed up that model development and to speed up finding those compute efficiency multipliers that really get us more from each dollar of compute. So when we're talking about it, each team is kind of representing what they would do with that compute. And then we have a really open and frank discussion about how we think about ROI. And because we can allocate that compute so dynamically, we can make changes, we can make adjustments in that on a relatively short time horizon.
The efficiency thing is so interesting to me. I'm curious if you have a sense of how much more efficient you are versus your own internal benchmarks from a year ago or something, or versus others that you have some sense of how efficient they are. How do you measure what efficiency means?
So there's a couple different ways I would think about it. From a model perspective, I think the analogy people have when these new models come out is they're kind of like cars. You had a sedan before, and then you might have the higher end version of that sedan, and you're kind of moving up the chain. And I think that is true in terms of model intelligence. The place that analogy kind of breaks down a little bit is people think, okay, going from the sedan to the sports car, I'm going to get much less fuel efficiency, right? I'm not going to buy the sports car for the gas mileage. In our case, we actually see both improvements, huge improvements in capability, but also in model efficiency. And so if you look at going from Opus, 4 to 4.5, 4.6, and now 4.7, each one of those leaps, they're not equal, but each one of those leaps to a new model has a multiplier in terms of how much more efficient it is at processing tokens effectively. And that just doesn't serve customers. That also helps us internally as well. Because if you think about if we're using the model if we're doing reinforcement learning on the model, It's basically inference within a sandbox with a reward function, right? And so if the model's better at more efficient at inference, that RL is more efficient as well. And so we're able to do this kind of win-win where the customer is getting more capability when we release a new model. And then we're able to serve that model sometimes, again, a multiple more efficient than the prior generation. And then when we're in between generations, we're dynamically deploying efficiency improvements kind of in between these like more step function model changes. And so it is always getting more efficient over time. And what fuels that is the research team. So if you think about it, all these things are very connected. These various tasks and workloads that we have internally all kind of fit together in this way of doing R&D for model capabilities, for compute efficiency, for serving customers, and then having internal workloads that can be sped up by using the best models, sometimes models that we haven't released.
Most software companies try to maximize your time on their app to juice engagement. Ramp does the exact opposite. Ramp understands that no one wants to spend hours chasing receipts, reviewing expense reports, and checking for policy violations. So they built their tools to give that time back, using AI to automate 85% of expense reviews with 99% accuracy. And since Ramp saves companies 5%, it's no wonder that Shopify runs on Ramp, Stripe runs on Ramp, and my business does too. To see what happens when you eliminate the busy work, check out ramp.com/invest. Felix by Rogo is a personal finance agent that turns a single prompt into finished, client-ready work using your firm's own templates, context, and standards. Send Felix an email like, "Take these comments and turn them for me," or "Update my tracker with the context of these emails," or "Run the ability to pay math on this buyer," and Felix sends back finished PowerPoint decks, Excel models, and sourced research. Felix works the way your team already does, delivering work quickly and accurately around the clock. Learn more at rogo.ai/Felix. OpenAI, Cursor, Anthropic, Perplexity, and Vercel all have something in common. They all use WorkOS. And here's why. To achieve enterprise adoption at scale, you have to deliver on core capabilities like SSO, SCIM, RBAC, and audit logs. That's where WorkOS comes in. Instead of spending months building these mission-critical capabilities yourself, you can just use WorkOS APIs to gain all of them on day zero. That's why so many of the top AI teams you hear about already run on WorkOS. WorkOS is the fastest way to become enterprise-ready and stay focused on what matters most, your product. Visit workos.com to get started. You said something really important before, which is the returns to being at the frontier are really high. Can you just explain that in as much detail as you can? It sounds obvious when you say it, but there's certainly been some camps that like, oh, I can use the 6-month-old model and it's a fraction of the cost and I'll just use that and that'll be catching up all the time. And that just like hasn't been the case. Like everyone, the second Opus 4.7 comes out, like even me as a consumer, the thing you do is you switch it on, or GPT 5.5 comes out, you switch on the new one right away. Like I want the best. So talk about the returns to being on the frontier and why it's so high.
I think it's a couple things. It's every time we have a new model, there's a set of capabilities that are different. People tend to think about model intelligence as IQ. It's a single number. Okay, this model was at 110, and then it goes to 125. We think of it kind of differently. Intelligence for us is multidimensional. It's not just a score. In fact, we find that, yes, everyone publishes their model benchmark cards. Find that a lot of those benchmarks are saturated. We publish it too, but what our measurement is what the customers tell us. Like, what is the real world capability of this model? And as we've released better and better models, what we've seen is it's not just, the outright intelligence. It's also the ability to do long horizon tasks. It's the ability to use tools or computer use. It's the ability to do things for agentic tasks that have specific value even faster, right? Which means that in some sense, if you have 2 employees and they're maybe both equally capable, someone takes a week to do an assignment, someone does it in a day. Well, that second person, if they're continuing to do that, can be 7 times better, right? They might be equally capable at something, maybe just take longer times to do it. So all of those factor in to then how customers experience it. And what we found very consistently is by releasing new models, the TAM is unlocked in a unique way. Like more TAM gets unlocked, more use cases are possible. And a good illustration of that is this last 4 months that we've had at the company, right? We started the year with about $9 billion of run rate revenue, and we ended the quarter with north of $30 billion of run rate revenue. I mean, that kind of a change is really enabled by these model intelligence leaps and then the products that we build around them. And so that's what I mean by the returns for frontier intelligence are really high. I think that's unique to enterprise because in consumer, sometimes you don't see that as readily, that consumers really are pushing the limits of what the models can do. Whereas in enterprise, like our customers are always now, it started with coding, but it's really expanded beyond that very meaningfully. But each model generation gives you the chance to do more with it, to do it better, to do it more efficiently. And customers see that, and then they invest really heavily in more tokens with the newer models. And we just have seen that cycle play out again and again. And that's a core thesis of our business, that especially in enterprise, the returns to frontier intelligence are not slowing down.
The things that push that frontier is like a sci-fi story or something from books I was reading when I was growing up. It seems as though in the major labs, we've reached this point, someone on your team said it recently, of like recursive self-improvement, where the models themselves are building and doing a lot of the research to do the next generation of improvement. And that there is some sort of, if I think about the frontier that you're pushing and OpenAI is pushing and compare that to the open source models, that maybe the gap will widen as a result of you getting there first to this like recursive thing. How do you think about that? Like, tell us how we should think about this idea of recursive self-improvement in the models themselves, because it seems like getting there first is incredibly important, because then you just can continue to separate yourself versus those that haven't reached it yet.
I would say we do see progress accelerating. We see, I can't speak for other companies, but for us, the scaling laws are, alive and well, and we're seeing that, even with releases more recently like Mythos. Right now, within the company, 90+% of our code is actually written by Claude Code, right? A lot of Claude Code's code is written by Claude Code. And so you think of this as like, why do we allocate compute internally? Why would we forego revenue for it? It's because the models themselves are helping us to build that next generation of models. And so in addition to this capability leap that you would have just from the scaling laws, talent is really important. And that talent with the best models can really accelerate the development of the capabilities. And we're really seeing that. We don't really think about models as like closed or open. We think of them as frontier or not. And the ones that are at the frontier, clearly are capturing this economic value, driving meaningful ROI for customers. And we are just investing behind that thesis. And that means, both compute, but it also means talent to use that compute and use our own models to really accelerate the development. The other piece of it is it's not just the models, it's the products that get built on top of them, right? So we had 30 different product and feature releases in January. The pace of that has accelerated as well, and that's enabled in part by utilizing the models with the talent that we have to really, accelerate ways to access this underlying intelligence. That's kind of our theory of the case on the product side.
How do you think about this weird world where you mentioned the talent and the leverage, and they're not writing code themselves, and Claude Code's writing its own code? It seems like the last step of that would be you don't even need the talent to tell the thing what to do. It just figures out what to do on its own, and that's like the ultimate, the thing then just runs and is only constrained by compute or something. Am I being too crazy about that, or is that future possible, do you think?
I think that the core of our company is still a research lab. I think it's maybe not as well understood. Maybe it's getting more understood from the outside. But we're doing experiments. We are doing things that push the limits of what our models can do. And that research and that engine is upstream of everything else that we've talked about. And so that is enabled by the models today. It's not entirely done by the models. Over time, we think that the models will get better. They'll be more helpful in that process. But, having the best talent to set the direction, not just the priorities, but some of the new areas of discovery, it just actually makes that research talent even better, right? And so I think of it as, accentuating and accelerating the talent that we already have. We talk a lot about how talent density beats talent mass. And I think that's true here. Like we want the densest collection of AI research talent and inference engineering talent, and that enabled with the best models, we think is a really winning combination.
How are scaling laws talked about internally? Like the sort of consensus has been you've got different components of them. You've got like pre-training, you've got post-training, you've got reasoning, and that all of these are kind of moving at different paces. And to hit a true wall, they would all need to fall down. Like that's sort of like how the world is now conceptualizing scaling laws. How are they talked about internally? How do you think about them?
Yeah, I mean, we look at models at various points in their development. We can see, during a pre-training run, how does this model compare to a prior model that we did on these kind of loss curves, and that gives us a sense for model capability. You can do the same thing as you think about RL, and then probably as importantly is when customers get their hands on it. Like, what are they seeing? Where are they identifying pain points? And those pain points are then become like training targets for us, right? We don't train on customer data in the enterprise side. On the prosumer side, it's only if you opt in. But customers tell us things like, "Hey, I wish the model were better at this," or "I had this particular place where it got stuck, and I could build this other product, but the capability needs to be further than that." What we usually tell them is, "Okay, build your product for that because we're going to, on the R&D side, improve that over time." And so there is this like connected loop, but internally we're always looking at different models that are being trained, different snapshots that we have, and comparing them, internally and to a lesser extent externally against, our own measure, and then ultimately how our customers view them as well.
And it feels like there's just no slowdown in the scaling laws themselves. Is that like a fair characterization?
For us, that's a fair characterization. Yeah, we are extremely, obviously a bunch of the authors of the scaling laws papers are amongst our founders.
Yeah.
But, notwithstanding that, we can be a bit of a skeptical bunch. Like, we hold ourselves to a really high standard. Again, it's this kind of idea of a research lab. It's very kind of scientific method, and people are constantly challenging previously held assumptions. But from what we see, the scaling laws are not slowing down.
So if that's true, you said before it's hard for humans to be exponential in their thinking and not linear. Like, if that continues to be true for however many more turns of the crank here, how do you do that thing of not thinking linear and thinking exponential yourself in your job and for the business? Like that, the implications are really hard to reason through. Exponential growth rate is one thing, but exponential growth of capability, I don't even know how to get my head around it. So how do you get your head around it?
We think about the world as scenarios. It's very hard to have a point estimate in this business, and then having a very low bar for updating your current priors or your current perspective, because it could be the case that something a month ago was true that's just not true today, and that breaks your model. And so this old we'll forecast once a quarter, and we'll revisit this in 3 months at the next board meeting. That doesn't work for our business. It's so dynamic that we have to always think about, our models couldn't do this before and they could do this now. What does that mean for the TAM? We've seen this in coding first, right? Where, starting with around Sonnet 3.5, 3.6, we started to see this really remarkable jump in capability, which was then followed by adoption and usage and revenue. And it was a little hard to predict that, but now we can use coding as an analog for a lot of what's happening elsewhere in the economy and elsewhere in our business. And so we kind of look at pattern recognition in our own business to try to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Literally 15 minutes before you got here, the news came out about your partnership with xAI in the Tennessee facility. It makes me curious about how you are canvassing the world for, that is an opportunity you decided to do. I'm sure there's a universe of things that you've explored. What is the strategy for trying to get more in creative ways? Bring us a little bit more into that.
We announced a partnership with SpaceX for their Colossus facility in Memphis. We're really excited about that. It's going to allow us to continue to expand, especially on the consumer and prosumer side. But that's just one example of us just, as you said, looking for near-term compute wherever we can get it. As the compute base grows, that near-term compute becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of what's available and what's out there. But we look at it as, can we deploy that compute that's available productively? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. But if we can, then we look at kind of the economic return on it, based on what it's priced, what duration we have it for, where it's located, what type of compute it is, and how efficiently we can run it. So we have kind of a process to assess. And that same process, by the way, we use to assess longer term deals as well. So last month, we signed a 5 gigawatt deal with Google and with Broadcom for TPUs. Starting in 2027. We also signed a deal with Amazon for Trainium for up to 5 gigawatts as well. It was an over $100 billion commitment, and a lot of that compute is actually already landing and will land in the rest of this year into next year. And so if you think about it, it's a bit of this layer cake of compute that's starting at different times with different capabilities, and we're very dynamically comparing that compute. It's price performance over time. That's really, really important to us. When it lands, and what we think we can do with it internally in the business. And so there's so many different variables you have to optimize for around, what compute it is, at what cost, and over what time horizon. But we have a pretty dynamic way of looking at kind of near-term compute and then medium to long-term compute. But the things we're assessing are largely the same. What is different is just the time horizon.
What about the trade-off? You said price per performance, the trade-off between like cost per token or something, throughput, and speed. From the customer perspective, they care about both. Speed probably unlocks some capability and use cases that are really interesting that we don't know about yet as these things get faster. Can you talk a little bit about that trade-off in compute as you're assessing it?
As we look across, 3 different chip platforms, we also have multiple generations of chips within it, right? So it could be TPU, V5e and V6 and V7 and Trainium 2, Trainium 3. All of them are at different places on the price performance curve. And then we importantly look at how we will utilize it, right? Price performance is important because of efficiency. Speed is also important for certain use cases as well. So we look at the compute down to a very granular level in terms of like what it can deliver for us and when. And that's something that we do, again, our compute team leads that, but we closely collaborate across the business to say like, where do we need this compute and for what, right? Okay, we might need, CPUs for RL. We might need this, more leading edge compute and we're going to deploy it for, our best and fastest models or for training them. And so from our perspective, it's customer demand, but it's also really down quite granular in terms of what is each chip best for, and then what will we have when.
I'm always so curious by the metabolism of, in this case, Anthropic for new compute, like how fast you could take, if I airdropped on you twice the compute that you have tomorrow, like would you consume that in, how fast would you consume that? If I airdropped 10 times the compute on top of you, how fast would you consume it? Can you calibrate us on that sort of thing? Like is demand actually, it feels like demand's unlimited between these 3, uses, training, internal, customer demand. Everyone's saying the same thing. Shortages everywhere, memory stocks, mooning. Is it that extreme that like if you 2x or 5x or 10x the amount available to you tomorrow, you would just like more or less instantly consume it?
This goes back to like how we use it and the fungibility of it. So the answer is, we're constrained kind of across those use cases internally today. And, I would say that, a year or two ago, it would have been harder to consume, especially like a heterogeneous kind of compute drop in your example, really quickly because these chip platforms are different and they are different. Some are harder to operate. Some of them have, idiosyncrasies in terms of how we use it. I would say today that, getting a bunch more compute, I think it would be deployed, very rapidly across those different use cases. We probably have the same kind of allocation or calibration that we do with compute today. But it's become a lot easier for us to spin up very quickly and deploy like almost any type of compute. And that's something, again, we think is a real advantage.
Back to the ways the customers are using Anthropic. One of the interesting tensions and trade-offs that I'm fascinated to hear how you think through is between sort of the platform approach where I build my business on top of Claude and it powers my thing versus you doing the thing that I wanted to build.
Right.
So this is like the classic, Claude design versus Figma or something like this. How do you think about the right balance of how deep into the application layer you should go versus just being a pure enabling layer of like, we're going to provide the reasoning engine and the intelligence and, world go forth and build whatever you want, pay us through the API or whatever. That seems like a fascinating internal discussion and tension to some degree.
Yeah, the way I would think about it is most of what we're building is platform. And we think that there's so many examples of where a platform can accrue a lot of value, but the customers who are building on that platform actually accrue even more value. We think that's what we're setting up for today. It's maybe akin to the early days of AWS, right? If you think about the Claude platform and all the tools and services that are now built into it, because it's not just the raw model access, it is, prompt caching and the ability to use virtual machines and, Claude code being called within there, or Dispatch, or the Claude Agents SDK, managed agents. All of these are effectively, I think of as vectors to access that model intelligence for other companies to build into their own products. That's most of what we're focused on and really most of where we think the business is going and from where we are today. That said, like we will also build our own applications on that same platform where a couple of things are true. Number one, if we feel like we have a vision into where the models are going, and we can kind of demonstrate that and create customer value in that, that might be something like Claude Code, right? We are able to say, actually, a lot of what's out there in the market was developer-led. Claude Code is a platform that's Claude-led, and we think the models can't quite do that today when it was launched, a little over a year ago. But we think they'll get there, and they have. And so one is kind of building ahead to model capabilities. The second is thinking about ways to like demonstrate value for the ecosystem that others might emulate, right? If you think about Claude for financial services or Claude for life sciences, or even something like Claude Security, these are ways in which we've kind of composed the platform. Again, we're building on the same platform as our customers, and we think that creates like a level playing field. We also think that there's so much value that's going to accrue in some of these areas that our customers can win and we can win as well, which is why you've seen, as we've launched some of these products, we've done them in a collaborative kind of partnership-oriented way, whether that be on the security side or design or financial services. We've partnered with the ecosystem. So I think of our strategy as mostly horizontal. We'll build vertical where we think we have some value to add or a perspective that's useful or a way to demonstrate to the market like how we think about our platform adding value. And a lot of the value is going to accrue to the customers that are building on top of it. Our goal is build the best models and then build the products and tools and services that allow that intelligence to proliferate within customers.
How much do you care that it's just a reality that people are scared of you? That like there's a sense that because you control the most essential piece of these new applications, the underlying intelligence reasoning engine, that may totally be true and maybe already is true, that more of the value is accruing on top of the Anthropic platform than is being captured by it. But nonetheless, it's still scary to imagine, and I guess maybe you could say something similar about cloud and AWS or something like that. But how much do you think and care about the fact that some of your would-be customers or existing customers are in fact scared of you as a competitor?
Part of what is hard in this business is it's changing so quickly. So the model capabilities sometimes even surprise us.
Yeah.
And so when we release models or products on top of that, there's an element of what's happened, in prior waves over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It's happening in months now. And when we release things, people are also surprised by it in some ways in the same way that we were surprised by it. But I think fundamentally what we are trying to do is be very partner oriented towards the ecosystem. And that means that, we have, early access programs. We work very closely with customers. We listen to them about what capabilities they want. That doesn't mean that the things we release are sometimes not moments where you're like, wow, that's way more powerful than I thought it would be, or I didn't realize the models would be able to do that this quickly. I think that part of that is a reality of where we are in this cycle and in this kind of development of intelligence. But part of it is also we want to make those capabilities really accessible, and that should accrue a lot of value to customers as well. And customers that are front-footed on that and adopt and frankly, also ones that are building and using the tools that we offer on our platform, we think we can actually accelerate them. I think some of it's a reality of kind of frontier model development, but our approach to it is probably a little different and more partner-oriented.
You said before going 9 to 30 in the first quarter. The pace is so insane, which makes me wonder about pricing. Like the dynamic of how to price tokens or use of the system is so fascinating to me, because I think a lot of people a year ago would say price is it's just going to constantly fall. But actually what's happening is it's going up in many cases. And this is true at different levels, whether it be the Mythos pricing that is quite high because it's so powerful. The cost of an H100, the rental price of a cost of an H100 is, looks like a smile curve. I'm very curious why, if everyone is compute constrained, why everyone doesn't just raise prices a lot to try to find what the right equilibrium is. And so I'd love you to just riff on pricing, how you think about it, what the trade-offs are, why not raise prices a lot?
The company is only a little over 5 years old. This past March was the 3rd anniversary of the first dollar of revenue into the business. And we only had a frontier model for real for the first time in March of 2024. So the time scale of these things is an important backdrop. Our pricing has been relatively stable across, Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus, and now Mythos is obviously is newer. But we've made very few pricing changes. The biggest pricing change we made was to bring down the price of the Opus family when we launched Opus 4.5. And if we thought about why did we do that, it's really because we found that Opus class models were underutilized relative to their capability, right? And so people were trying to often fit an Opus problem into a Sonnet workload. And because of the efficiency improvements that we were able to make, we were able to serve that very efficiently from our perspective, but actually bring down the price, which made it more accessible to customers. And so it goes back a little bit to like, we want our customers to generate a lot of value from it, and they're generating a ton of ROI from our models today. We want that to just continue, because our goal is to proliferate this, throughout the ecosystem. We think we're in the very, very early innings on all of these use cases. The best way to do that is, to get this intelligence in the hands of as many businesses, from startups, to digitally native businesses, to the largest companies in the world. Some of that means that you have to make it in a price point that's accessible and that allows them to get a lot of value from it. Changing the pricing for Opus, actually, you see this Jevons paradox, right? Like, we lowered the price of it, but the consumption went up way, way more than what you would have expected. And so because we kind of, hit that sweet spot, for customers, they were able to use it a lot more. We had the efficiency to be able to serve it to customers at scale. And then they were able to build that into their workloads such that when we released Opus 4.6, it's a model improvement, they can slot it in. We didn't change the price. And so we think pricing stability is important. And we also think that pricing to get that value and to see that kind of Jevons paradox happen is really important.
The other component of this is margins, and how you think about margins as a business. Again, because this is so unbelievably capital intensive to build these frontier labs, you've got the levers we talked about with it, which is efficiency, price, like both those things, relate to margin. Apologies if it's like a naive perspective, but given how much capital you need, why not just say we want to have a healthy margin and sort of set the price accordingly, and maybe that price can come down if efficiency is better or whatever. And so I'm curious how you think about margins as it relates to pricing and the business.
Yeah, I would say we think about what is the return on our compute spend, right? Writ large. So that is all of the different workloads that we've talked about, whether it's serving customers, model development. If you think of all of those are kind of in support of revenue over different timescales, right? If I serve inference, it's in support of revenue today. If I do model development, it might help for a capability that unlocks TAM that drives revenue 6 months from now, and everything in between. If I do internal acceleration to launch a new product, all of these things are in support of that. I will say our returns on those that compute expense today are robust. They're robust, and we think of it as what is the return on that full envelope of compute. And so we feel really good about where we are from that perspective, and we're balancing delivering value to customers with also seeing a really, really strong return on that compute ourselves. And if you think about when revenue grows, as we mentioned, kind of in Q1, it's not like we onboarded a bunch of new compute in that time period. We talked about compute comes based on a ramp that might have been determined 12 months ago. And so this idea of a variable cost that's like on the incremental to serve a customer is a little bit like, it doesn't really fit our business, right? It tries to maybe fit our business into like a software paradigm. But that's not the case. And in actuality, compute is supporting all of these activities, and we're really generating a robust return on that compute, and that's our measuring stick. And so, I think it's something where, we think of the compute envelope that we have as the thing that is able to govern how much we're able to drive revenue both over the short term and the long term.
So if you're the this great customer of the compute providers, what does that group need to do to be great, to be a great provider to you, to help you drive that return?
So we're fortunate in that we have really great partners in Amazon, in Google, in Microsoft, but also with Broadcom and NVIDIA as well. And so our ecosystem, we are the only model that's on all three clouds today. We're the only language lab that's using all three of these chip platforms. And really, these collaborations are much deeper than just like procurement. I think that's something that's often lost. If you think about our relationship with Amazon, our teams are deeply embedded with the Annapurna Labs team. We are really good users of Trainium. We've spent a lot of time and energy and worked closely with the team, and internally we plan capacity together. Right? If you think about the three clouds, they're great distribution engines for us too. We have a really, really robust first-party business as well. But these are multifaceted partnerships, whether it be on developing the chips themselves, landing that capacity, serving it, and then ultimately distributing it to the customers.
I'm thinking about your function, like the finance team, and the ways that you might use. I'm picturing this like ROI on compute thing on different horizons with all these complex variables, which makes me wonder, how do you use these powerful tools yourself internally to run your group and the business? Like what is the deployment of Claude Code and Claude in general on the finance team at Anthropic?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because we were using Claude Code, about a year ago. And, I started asking people, like, is everyone just vibe coding? And we started to use Claude Code as almost like an assistant, a digital coworker, not just for coding tasks. And that actually was early in what eventually became Cowork, right? That was kind of an extension of Claude Code to say what it's done for agentic software development, it should do for all of knowledge work. But then, we started to productionize that, and I'm actually really proud. We spend a lot of time with our product team too. They kind of see how we use it and get input and feedback from that. But today, all of our legal entities, we can produce the statutory financial statements using Claude. And yes, a human checks it, but all of those financial statements are produced with Claude. We also have a more real-time platform called AntStats. It used to take a lot of time to sift through all the data, get to conclusions, write a memo about it, or publish a regular report on what's happening over the course of the day, what's driving it. We now have a library of skills for Claude that are specific to finance. I think last I checked, there were over 70 of them that everyone can kind of access through this kind of common repository. And on top of that, we built an MFR, a monthly financial review skill. And it can produce our monthly financial review. It's 90 to 95% ready. And then all of our discussion becomes about what do we do? What are the implications? Not what exactly happened, because Claude is not just reporting the weather. It's also helping to think about drivers and why did the number change in the way it did? And that gives you tremendous insight into the business, both in terms of this MFR that we do, but also on a daily basis. And so what used to take hours to produce, a weekly report for, what's driving revenue or what's driving our compute utilization, now comes down to 30 minutes. And then we can spend our time on the actual strategic implications of the business. We can also get it in the hands of business leaders much more quickly. And so it's just meant that the insight engine is a lot faster within the company. We also have I have a dashboard. I look at token usage across
the leaderboard.
We don't compensate people on it. No one's trying to token max for that. But it's really interesting because some of the most senior people within the finance team are actually the biggest users of tokens. So it is not just the 22-year-old who joined and has a coding background and was doing that on the weekends and brought it to work. It's also people using the tools to change how they're working. I think our number one user is our head of tax, and he's really focused on tax policy engines and automating large parts of the workloads that are happening within the team. So I love seeing that. And I tell people, if we're not super users of this, if we're not pushing the limits of it, how can you expect customers to do that?
As your business scales up, everything gets more complex, especially your compliance and security needs. With so many tools offering band-aids and patches, it's unfortunately far too easy for something to slip through the cracks. Fortunately, Vanta is a powerful tool designed to simplify and automate your security work and deliver a single source of truth for compliance and risk. There's a reason that Ramp, Cursor, and Snowflake all use Vanta. It frees them to focus on building amazing differentiated products, knowing that compliance and security are under control. Invest Like the Best listeners get a special offer of $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/invest. I know firsthand how complex the tech stack is for asset management firms. And seemingly every new tool and data source makes the problem even worse, adding more complexity, more headcount, and more risk. Ridgeline offers a better way forward, one unified platform that automates away that complexity across portfolio accounting, reconciliation, reporting, trading, compliance, and more, all at scale. Ridgeline is revolutionizing investment management, helping ambitious firms scale faster, operate smarter, and stay ahead of the curve. See what Ridgeline can unlock for your firm. Schedule a demo at ridgeline.ai.
Just as a human, does it freak you out at all that all of these, I've heard so many examples like this, it starts to feel like we just start doing the stuff that AI tells us to do, like in the sales example or the calendar or whatever. And maybe that's great. Maybe it's just such a better coordinator and, wide thinker and optimizer than we ever could be, that we should do what it tells us to do. But it feels like ever so slightly dystopian to me that reality is coming quickly. I've had examples of it too. And it feels kind of cool. Like it's helpful. But at the same time, if I really close my eyes, I'm like, oh, I'm just like doing what it tells me versus me telling it what to do. It's a really interesting, just like human dynamic that I'm curious for your take on.
I maybe have a slightly different view on it in that I think like it is made, we've been able to hire great people at the company, but it has made even those incredibly talented people so much more productive. And there's a little bit of this, I think of it again like Jevons paradox, but for labor, which is that we have people who become incredibly more productive. We've hired a lot more people because of that, because there's no shortage of work to do. And now with the assistance of Claude, people are spending less time in that MFR trying to reconcile some number, but they're actually thinking, oh, how do we reinvest this in the business? How do we think about, kind of dynamically allocating resources, whereas before I'm working to tie out a number, or I'm, in that accounting example, taking a long time to close the books. So I actually think of it as, maybe even more optimistically, that it is an accelerant to our productivity, and that actually means that we can get a lot more done, and that even as we grow the team, those people are more productive as well as they come up the curve on how to use Claude, within our company. And I think that's starting to be true across many companies as well.
I'd love to talk about investors and capital formation. Of course, you've had to raise tons and tons of capital. At the same time, it seems as though, like if I just squint my eyes and think about the multiple on current revenue, it's like not that crazy in terms of like where you're raising money. I'm so curious for you to teach us about what it's been like to interact with investors, like how you've seen their understanding of the company evolve and mature. Where do you think the investors as a group kind of like understand it now? Where are their misunderstandings about Anthropic? Tell us that side of your life.
So I joined the company about 2 years ago. We were closing our Series D at the time. Look, that was not a straightforward fundraising. The company really only had a frontier model in the middle of that fundraising. Towards the tail end of it, the FTX transaction was happening, which was liquidating a bunch of Anthropic shares. And so that was kind of the starting point. And at that point, the questions were around, like, why do you need to have a frontier model? Like, what's the returns to this? They're also around, our mission and how we approach things. People said, well, hey, aren't AI safety and building a really big business, aren't those things at odds? And there were also a lot of other misconceptions on your sales force is really small. Don't you need to scale it like all these enterprise software companies? And so there was just a bit of a paradigm around trying to fit us, into a particular mold that had existed before. Over time, it's evolved. We, at the end of 2024, we raised the Series E. The business had scaled to, close to $1 billion of run rate revenue. But the day of our first close was the day of the DeepSeek news came out.
Yeah.
Obviously, we got the close done, but certainly a ton of volatility as people then said, wait a minute, should I just totally re-underwrite how I think about AI in total? And so that was a Series E. Obviously, we brought on, great investors across all of these, but people still had some of those questions, but they looked at our forecast and they thought, okay, I get it. You've grown, wow, you've grown to, $1 billion of run rate revenue so quickly, but there's no way you're going to be able to keep
again,
up. Yeah, that's just not possible, right? And there's laws of physics. You're an enterprise, which is great, but the adoption is going to take so much longer. I mean, look at how long it took with cloud and how many people are still on-prem. The business continued to prove out the thesis that the return to frontier intelligence is really high, that we are really focused on what's really happened is model-led growth, enabled by products and our go-to-market team and our distribution. And then I think what they also saw was that this thesis of like, hey, it's really important to build this transformative technology, but to do it in the right way and do it responsibly, that had this really interesting interlink with our business that most people didn't really understand or really believe, which was that we invest in research, not just in model development, but also in AI safety research, right? Like we pioneered interpretability, which is, think of it as like an MRI for the model to see inside the neural network, how it works. We pioneered alignment science, which is, you want the model to do what you tell it to do, and how often does it do that, and how often does it stray from that? And those things are important for our mission, and that's why we did them. But they had these downstream effects where it turns out if you can look inside the model, you're better at building them. And then the last linkage, if you're selling to enterprises, like we now sell to 9 of the Fortune 10, all of those enterprises are entrusting us with, customer information, with their data. They're interacting with their